So welcome everyone who is joining us. I'm gonna wait a few seconds before we formally start, as people are entering the virtual room and sitting down and maybe having a cup of coffee like we are having. And then we'll get started on this conversation about EU digital borders with our guest, Petra Monar. So I'm seeing the room filling up quite quickly, so I think we should start. We have an hour, and I want to make the most out of it. So again, a warm welcome to everyone tuning in for what is already the 8th conversation in our Transformer State series on digital government and human rights. And before we begin, I should say that this conversation is recorded. Is being recorded, I mean, and will be made available on our center's YouTube channel and our webpage in about a week's time. Also, please keep in mind, everyone who's joining us, that there will be a Q&A with our guest Petra Molnar in the last 15 minutes of this conversation. So please, as soon as you have a question during the conversation, please enter it in the chat, in the Q&A, I mean, at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to select some of those questions at the end to ask to Petra. Now, for each conversation in our series, my colleagues and I at the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project interview a human rights practitioner, academic, or expert on a specific case study of digital government and its implications for human rights. And that conversation is always about an hour long. And as those of you who joined us earlier will probably know, one of our aims with this conversation series is to introduce a wider audience of human rights students, academics, and practitioners, as well as any other interested audiences to the implications of digital government for the field of human rights. And that also brings me to a second objective behind this Transformer State series, which is to create what we call a community of practice, of people interested in the advent of the digital state and its consequences for human rights and for human beings, more broadly speaking. And so through these conversations, but also to regular blogs written by students and academics and activists working on these issues, and that are being published on our webpage, we hope to serve as a hub for an interesting discussion and exchange on the rise of the digital state and human rights. Now, today we will talk about the digital and increasingly extraterritorial borders, border protection of the European Union, with our guest, the inspiring Petra Molnar. And in recent years, the European Union has been rapidly introducing digital technologies into its border management processes, especially as it attempts to monitor and control movement before people on the move reach its physical borders. Those technologies are becoming increasingly central to the EU's efforts in this migration area. And this includes, for example, the use of drone surveillance to facilitate interceptions and pushbacks of boats, and biometric scanning in partner countries to identify and prevent certain individuals from traveling in the first place. And those are just two of many examples. Now, this conversation today will examine the human rights implications of the EU's use of AI and other new technologies to shift its border control operations ever further away from its physical territory, and to screen for risk through prediction. What we will focus on especially is the importance of shifting our gaze away from technocratic discussions in Brussels among policymakers and consultancies about AI to the lived experiences of human beings on the move who are confronted by these new digital tools. And this gap between technocratic on the one hand and human realities on the other hand is quite significant in the EU, we find. To give one brief example here at the outset, I was reading a recent study by RAND Europe, commissioned by Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, on what AI might mean for this agency. And just to quote an assessment, a very frank assessment by RAND in that study, and here comes the quote: On average, AI-based capabilities are expected to have the greatest impact on the speed and efficiency with which border security functions can be carried out. As such, there's more confidence in the positive contribution of AI to make border security functions more efficient by saving financial and human resources, rather than the ability of AI to qualitatively improve the results of processes underpinning such functions, between brackets, e.g., in their accuracy. Now, I think it's important to remind ourselves that there are actual human beings who will experience the consequences of trade-offs like the ones presented by Rand right here, which is the goal of today's conversation. So I'll end there after that quick summary. Let me now introduce you to my colleague, Ngozi Nwanta. Ngozi is a doctoral student at New York University School of Law, and she's also an affiliate with our Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. Her doctoral research focuses on development, finance, and the role of law in governing identities and infrastructures, with a particular focus on digital technologies and digital identification projects. Ngozi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for the great introduction. And it is my honor to introduce our panelist, our speaker for today, for today's webinar, Petra Mona. So Petra is a human rights lawyer and a researcher specialized in migration, technology, and human rights. She is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab, which is an organization that undertakes research and advocacy related to new legal technologies and their impact on refugees and other displaced communities. Last year, Petra authored a report about the role of digital technologies in the European Union's migration central control policies, which is the subject of our conversation today, called Technological Testing Ground. And Victoria just shared a link to the report below. Now, today's conversation is all about the EU's introduction of digital technologies into its border control operations, as Christian greatly introduced. Now, but all too often, the conversation about digital technologies can serve to steer discussion away from the underlying policy discussions, decisions, and ideologies at hand, through focusing instead only on technologies themselves. To avoid this kind of technicized, depoliticized approach, we want to begin today's conversation by bringing out the politics of migration in the EU. So Petra, can you briefly tell us about the EU's approach to migration? What is the context? What is the historical background within which technologies are being brought into EU's border control policies? In other words, what is the starting point here?
Thank you so much, Ngozi, and thank you, Christian and Victoria, for inviting me today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and I hope that it will be a great way to unpack some of these complicated threads that are woven throughout the way that the EU, but really, the world is dealing with migration these days. And I think it's a great starting point, like you said, to try and get at some of the underlying reasons why we are seeing some of these more technocratic or techno-solutionist ways that Europe and other jurisdictions are moving towards migration management. I mean, because none of this really is new. In my work, I look at surveillance and automation, but I'm trying to track it from a perspective in terms of how power operates in society. And here in the EU in particular, over the last number of years, we've been seeing a turn towards politics of exclusion, deterrence, and this sharpening of borders. And you can really see that manifesting in a variety of ways. For example, last year's new pact on migration, which makes reference to really interesting ways that the region is dealing with migration. New databases and technologies at and around the border, Europeanized returns process. This was all followed up by designating Turkey as a safe country for people who are seeking asylum, which really undermines and changes the way that people are moving into the European territory. But it also has some really violent manifestations, and Christian already made a reference to this. We've been seeing an increase of violent pushbacks, detentions, and deportations. And some of these pushbacks have led to deaths, particularly in the Aegean and the Mediterranean seas. But really, the starting point has to be a broader conversation and a nuanced conversation about who belongs and who is demarcated as the outsider. And in particular, how powerful entities like states, bolstered by the private sector influences, are able to play up these differences and use increasingly more technologies at and around the border to sharpen this divide.
Wow. So against this background, how and where are various digital technologies being brought into these border control efforts? Could you give us examples of the kinds of technologies that are being piloted and deployed and are becoming increasingly central to this agenda?
Sure. And for those of you who are aware of my work, I sometimes use the perspective of trying to map out how these technologies are playing out on a person as they're moving through their migration journey. And I know it's a little bit artificial, of course, because the border as a concept is shifting and changing, and sometimes we need to unpick these concepts in a really critical way. And I know we will kind of get into this a little bit later in the discussion. But for me, it's actually helpful to try and demarcate how this is playing out on a person's life. So there's a lot of stuff that actually happens before a person even crosses a border. They might be in a humanitarian emergency and accessing services in a refugee camp and find themselves interacting with biometric technologies such as iris scans or fingerprinting. There's a lot of population prediction modeling that is now happening about people moving from conflict zones and the ways that they might be planning out their journeys. And then at the border space, in the more traditional sense, let's say, we're seeing an increase of kind of surveillance type technologies, unpiloted drones, aerostat machines, all sorts of predictive modeling that also is happening in that space too. And also some really, really fascinating and troubling experiments, such as AI type lie detectors that have made the news in recent years that are being piloted in a variety of jurisdictions. And also automated decision-making that impacts a person once they enter into a country and are interacting with the immigration and refugee determination process. And on the back end too, we've been trying to track technologies such as voice printing that is used in asylum applications in Germany, and different types of ways that communities on the move are tracked and surveilled and made knowable to the kind of state entity as it's trying to determine how public administration is going to proceed when it comes to dealing with communities on the move. But really in my work and in the report that we put out last year, the idea is to show this kind of tapestry, this global panopticon in ways that this is all connected, because it's easy to separate it in terms of use cases, but really what we're talking about is an increasing use of technologies at every point in a person's journey as they're on the move.
Okay. So in what ways does the EU's reliance on digital technologies change pre-existing policies and politics of migration? Is there anything different between what these technologies are offering or what these technologies are used to achieve as against what was in place prior to the coming into effect of these technologies? So what is new here? Could you, for example, speak to how these technologies are enabling a shifting of the border far outwards away from the physical territories of the EU and towards faraway geographical spaces?
Yeah, this is a really good question, I think, and it also picks up on what Christian used to introduce this discussion, this kind of obsession with making certain administrative decisions more speedy or efficient. And this is kind of a motivating logic that we've been seeing in a lot of immigration decision-making already. And it's kind of really just become more of an appetite when it comes to bringing in new technologies at and around the border. So in order to answer this question, I was really trying to reflect on what was and what is and what will be. And in a way, we are talking about a regime of decision-making in immigration and refugee law that has always been opaque and always been discretionary. It has always been about violent border logics and exclusions of certain communities, particularly along ethnic and racial lines, when we're talking about the way that people are able to exercise their internationally protected right to asylum. None of this is new. We've been dealing with this, for years and years and years. What is new is that now powerful actors such as states and, again, the private sector industry that has sprung up around this border industrial complex that some have called it, is able to capitalize on certain perspectives that matter in terms of pushing these discussions forward. So it's not, the starting point isn't what are the human rights implications of this technology, rather it's, for the private sector, how much money can be made in big border tech, and for the state, increasingly, particularly in the European Union, how can we fortress Europe and prevent people from being able to enter in the first place? And I think this is also where this shifting of the border, and this makes me think of a great book by Dr. Ayala Chahar called The Shifting Border, that really is challenging us to think about the concept of the border as something that is not static. It's something that's changing and shifting and becomes less and less about a physical experience, but it can be our phones, it can be our computers, it can be the way that we kind of move through the world. And it also then plays into policies of what some have called border externalization, or taking the border from its physical location and pushing it further and further afield. And European Union in particular is very good at this, and they've been doing it for years. This isn't anything super new. It's just a sharpest manifestation is now playing out, where you have states, for example, that are subcontracted to do the dirty work of the EU further and further afield to try and prevent people from even making it to European territory in the first place. And sometimes it's really hard to imagine what some of these frontier zones can look like. For those of you who are familiar with my work, most recently I've been based in Greece, which is in many ways at the frontiers of Europe's migration policy. And while I'm talking, I wanted to share some photos with you, if Victoria, you don't mind clicking through some of them. Perhaps just a bit of background. I work really closely with a fantastic photographer and filmmaker by the name of Kenya Jade Pinto. Most of these photos are hers, although the blurry ones like this one is mine. You'll be able to tell the difference. But what I try and do in my work is really document the securitization and the hostility that is around the border space, particularly in Europe, but we're also moving to look at other geographic contexts, such as the US-Mexico border, and the ways that biometrics are playing out in East Africa, for example, and in other MENA regions as well. And what we try and do in our work is really to try and capture this stark divide between these broad policies of exclusion, externalization, and shifting borders, but really highlight how this is actually playing out, and also the discrepancies that are present in and around the border space. And we can get into this a little bit later if you are interested in hearing more about the details of what I'm seeing on the ground, but often we're dealing with a really incongruous situation that really makes me think of the kind of pinnacle of cognitive dissonance. We're talking about the EU spending vast amounts of money on new technologies such as drones, algorithmic motion detection that is making its way into Greece. And yet oftentimes these camps before they're open don't have running water. So there's an interesting tension here. We're talking about a humanitarian emergency such as this one, for example. This is the old Samos camp before people were forcibly transferred into a new one, which you will see in a minute. But again, it really goes to show the kind of priorities of the region. We're essentially building glorified prisons or prison-like camps that are surrounded by barbed wire. You will see cameras and different types of technologies playing out in the way that people kind of interact with their new surroundings. But it really just goes to show that there is this kind of incongruity between, the European space having certain priorities that set the stage, also again underpinned by an increasingly voracious private sector that is making inroads in terms of how these kind of decisions are playing out. But it's not a human-centered approach, is what I'm trying to say. The human experience has really been left to the wayside.
Thanks so much for showing us those pictures as well. And just to say that Kenya Jade Pinto, who took a lot of those pictures, has done a great job, because it's really impressive how you've been able to sort of visualize what it's like when you go to the actual spaces in which people on the move are being received. Maybe that's too polite of a word. And as we discussed about earlier, that very much shows that contrast that we were talking about between around Europe or Deloitte writing a very clean study for people in Brussels versus showing pictures of what it's actually like to be in a place like that in Greece. I very much like, by the way, the EU, where are you picture. And sometimes, I mean, knowing from my own field work, in retrospect, it almost seems planted, that sort of evidence, right? Because you think this is too appropriate almost, but it sort of goes to the core of what you've been working on. EU, where are you? Maybe you're in Brussels discussing those AI strategies, but you're clearly not here making sure that people's rights are protected. Just final thing to say about that, by the way, what also strikes me is the sort of the contrast between cleanliness and messiness, if that's the right way of putting it. You know, like a study produced in Brussels often looks very clean. The people in hazmat suits look very clean and very anxious about not getting infected with any form of virus or germ or whatever. And then there's sort of the realities that you just showed as well, which are often much more messy. And in a way, this seems to me to be about a project trying to make everything very orderly and clean, whereas life is obviously not orderly and clean in that way. And I think that goes to the theme of our conversation today. Just wanted to ask you a follow-up question, Petra, and that is to take us into how you arrived at doing this research. What's the story there? And not just the personal story of how you arrived at doing this type of research, but also if you could tell us a little bit more. I mean, the photos already go into this to some extent, but what kind of methodologies did you use? What are your starting principles? And to what extent have you been very deliberate about choosing certain methodologies and certain principles to do this kind of work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, it's one that I don't often get asked, but it's something that I really think about daily, because I think it's really important to query our own position when it comes to the way that we arrive at certain projects and certain ways of working and living and moving through the world. And I really like that kind of dichotomy that you just mentioned between the messiness and the cleanliness and sterility of technology versus the messy human reality of life. I come very much from that side of things. You know, I used to be a migrant justice organizer before I became a lawyer. Never planned to be a lawyer, but that's a long story. I eventually made my way into law school and thought, you know, I would do kind of more, I hesitate to put it this way, but like traditional refugee law type things. I worked a lot on immigration detention, violence against women issues. And then quite randomly, honestly, stumbled into the area of this intersection between digital rights and human rights and the way that's playing out in migration. A colleague of mine and I did a report in Canada called Bots at the Gate, which was looking at automated decision-making in Canadian visa applications. And it really kind of blew my mind. I mean, I really was able to only do the immigration and refugee analysis because I didn't come from a digital rights or technical background. And you know, now it's been a few years and I've definitely been able to build up that side of analysis, but by no means do I ever pretend to say that I'm a technologist or even really a digital rights person. I'm a migration person through and through. And, you know, as someone who's also had a migration journey of my own and someone who wears multiple hats in multiple ways, the way I move through the world, it also, I think, allows me the ability to query certain things from an interdisciplinary and a multi-methodology perspective. So it's been a bit of a messy journey, but as someone who's trying to understand, again, the kind of threads, the tapestry of how this is all playing out in terms of the actors that are involved, the types of decisions that are made, and the way that this is playing out on people's lives, I actually think this messiness is really, really helpful. And for me also, I work from a really slow, deep methodological perspective. I'm also trained in qualitative research methods as an anthropologist. And so when I move through the world, I try and not take up too much space when I am listening to people and witnessing and holding space when it comes to their experiences, particularly when we're talking about really violent experiences or even, you know, technology-induced trauma, for example. I spend a lot of time listening and sitting and being quiet and being present. There's a reason why I'm in Greece and why I'm actually physically where I need to be able to foster the kind of deep relationships that I think are necessary. In terms of, you know, the way that this has kind of been playing out, I think in ways it's been fascinating because it, in my mind, allows for really rich, nuanced, deep, and complex conversation that is very messy, but is again, perhaps a little bit closer to what human reality is actually like. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't really square with conversations that are being had in different sectors. And it's been fascinating for me since the release of our report that you so kindly shared with the audience, We received a little bit of pushback because some people in the policy circles in Brussels, for example, don't consider it research worthy of engaging with. And, to that, I always say we can disagree on analysis, of course, but it's a bit rich to say that the kind of first person accounts that I'm privileged to be able to hear on a daily basis are not expert knowledge enough to be then introduced into conversations in these policymaker spaces. Because if that's not what we're really talking about, what's the point of even having these conversations? If we're not actively holding space for people's lived experience, then really it's just a feedback loop that we are engaged in. And unfortunately, this is what I have been seeing kind of in the digital rights space writ large. There is a lot of exclusion, a lot of gatekeeping, and just a really lack of a nuanced analysis when it comes to intersectionality, systemic racism, and the way that, again, technology plays out in real people's lives. We have a lot of work to do.
Perhaps to follow up on that, it's clear that you're sort of giving a critique here of the field that you've entered. And it's sort of interesting that you described your background as being in law, activism, anthropology, and now you've written a report which in its title has technology. And so to what extent do you think you're an intruder in a space that's occupied by other experts? And what would be sort of the response then to the existing research that has been done on the use of digital technologies in migration or the digital rights field more broadly speaking, coming from quite a different background than most people in that space?
Yeah, it's been really fascinating, and I think a longer term project would be to actually map out how the digital rights space and the migrant justice space has kind of been interacting with one another, kind of like a meta project. I'm going to make a note of that for maybe when I have time in the future. But I think it's been interesting. Yeah, I definitely, in many ways, years ago, there was, I think, I wouldn't say pushback, but just kind of not an interest in certain spaces to be having these kind of conversations. And that goes both ways. I think coming at it from the migration side of things, a lot of my colleagues, myself included, we didn't really engage with these issues because, frankly, when the people you're working with are facing deportation tomorrow, you're not necessarily thinking about AI or drones or automated decision-making. And conversely, if you're in the digital rights space and you talk a lot about privacy and data protection, all of that, it's hard to see how that can then maybe play out in different ways, whether we're talking about immigration or refugee camps, or whether we're talking about welfare applications or the criminal justice system. I think there has been this kind of divide between the two communities. But I will say what's been really wonderful is over the last few years, there are more and more bridges that are being built between different perspectives, different communities, and different ways of knowing and sharing and then learning from one another. And that's been really fascinating to see. And I hope that that trend continues in the future.
And as I understand it, you're working yourself on sort of bridging those gaps and trying to change the narratives and change the field in and of itself. You are working on a couple of projects that I think are relevant in that regard. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more.
Trying to, we don't always get it right either, but it's a learning process. But with a few colleagues over the last year, we've been trying to spin out this project that we're calling the Migration and Technology Monitor, which we're hoping would be a way to kind of counterbalance some of these problematic approaches and silencing that has been kind of happening in this space. It's an interdisciplinary collaboration between journalists, filmmakers. We also have the UN Special Rapporteur on Discrimination that's working with us. It's really as a hub for work that is being done in these spaces, but always thinking about how to center lived experience and also work from a participatory action research perspective. So instead, once again, not replicating this kind of very westernized way of producing knowledge that's very extractive, aka creating another entity or an institution that just goes in and kind of extracts knowledge from someone and writes a report about it, which, we are all guilty of it. I, as someone who's half an academic, half practitioner, and someone who writes a lot for a living, there is an element of kind of extraction in something that I do as well, and I am aware of it. But what we're trying to do is find a balance, find a way to create a community where we can learn from each other and also be able to shift some of the funding that is around to communities themselves, to researchers from within communities with lived experience of migration, and also these kind of technological, high-risk applications that we're seeing, so that people can do the work themselves. So we are not the ones kind of going in and parachuting in and doing that. It's not about giving voice to anybody. It always makes me think of this quote by Arundhati Roy that says, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. They're only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. I've been reflecting a lot on that in the last few weeks, and it's really something that's, I think, integral to the way that we're looking at trying to work in this space.
It's really interesting to hear about the forthcoming book, and I can't wait to sit down with a cup of coffee to really dissect every part of the book and internalize it. So following from the question that we just that Christian just asked you on how you're filling in the silences and gaps in the digital rights field, do you ever maybe see yourself as an outsider? Maybe do you ever think that your approach to analyzing the issues within this space is illegitimate, or that the knowledge you relay is not valuable enough, maybe when compared to like more tech-focused pieces? So what has your response been to this, and how do you perceive the added value of your research?
Yeah, thanks. This is a really important thing to reflect on, particularly when, I've been in this space a little bit now, and it's been fascinating to kind of try and map out the ways that certain conversations and critiques are happening. And even a few years ago, a lot of the policy level conversations in particular were centered around ethics of AI, ethics of technologies, and all of that. But the issues with ethics, very important, but they're non-binding, right? I mean, it's a normative idea that gets us thinking a lot, and it's super important. But if you're not also thinking about kind of the way that these more high-risk applications are playing out virtually in an area that is highly unregulated, that's where conversations around kind of human rights and human rights impacts can be quite useful. I mean, perhaps also as a caveat though, and those of you who know my work, I'm a very kind of reluctant lawyer in many ways. I think the law as a project can inherently itself be very violent and perpetuate all sorts of problematic power dynamics. So I even personally struggle with identifying with being a lawyer. But it can also be a very useful tool to be taken more seriously, which is something we all need to think about in different spaces in different ways, but also as a scaffolding on which to pin rights and responsibilities, particularly when we're talking about an area that is highly unregulated and that already is very opaque and discretionary. Because again, the context matters here. We're talking about immigration decision-making. We're talking about refugee law, which inherently there's a lot of opacity written into the way that the law is allowed to operate and be practiced, and then kind of the way that jurisprudence develops. There's a lot of kind of gray zone when it comes to the decision making. So then when you superimpose technological decision making on it, it creates a very, very messy and a very, very high risk kind of area. And when you don't have certain laws and governance mechanisms in place, people can kind of fall through the cracks. It's a fascinating space too, though, right? Because now the European Union has its proposed regulation on artificial intelligence that's been tabled a few months ago. Now it's going through the process. It's going to take a while before it's actually enforced. But it's interesting to see how a piece like that is trying to deal with high-risk human rights impacts of technologies, including the ones at the border. But again, I think it's interesting when you look at something like the AI Act, what are the silences there? Which voices are represented? Which experiences are the ones that are pushing the agenda? And how are certain things, even something considered like risk, and who gets to determine what is high risk? There's a lot of politics in that conversation too.
Absolutely. Just for our audience, I see that questions are coming in, but by all means, keep asking them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them soon. It's great that you see so much enthusiasm in the questions. That's a reflection on the interest in this topic, and also in Petra and your amazing work. I wanted to move on to the next part of the conversation, talking a bit about experimentation. But before we get there, just a brief question on methodology. Going back to the photos that you just showed, I read in your report that you made a very deliberate choice not to show the faces of the people that you've been speaking to, people on the move, either in Brussels or in Greece, that you spoke to, and that's part of a wider policy of the organization that you're based at. I was wondering if you could talk briefly about sort of, on the one hand, trying to make visible the human lived experiences and juxtaposing them with the very dry technological, technocratic approach in Brussels and other centers of power. But then not being able to show the people that you're talking to. How do you deal with that dilemma between wanting to give a meaning to their stories and showing their stories in a variety of ways, and then at the same time trying to protect the people that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a hard balance, you know, and for me, it's been really so instructive to work closely with a photographer that really thinks critically about visual representation in these spaces that are so loaded with power differentials. Because I think a lot of it has to do with the choices that are made in terms of how you tell a story and the stories that you're kind of entrusted with in this space. And it's really complicated because, for sure, I think images are such a powerful way to try and illuminate a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about that is invisible or really, really hard to see and hard to also conceptualize when we're talking about, you know, algorithmic decision making and, you know, biases in data sets, or even something like a drone. They're hard to see, they're kind of there, we know about them, but it's hard to pin them down. And especially as you're trying to explore the kind of the human side of it, how do you do that ethically and carefully and critically? I mean, my colleague Jade Pinto, I would definitely urge you to check out her work. And I know there are others who are thinking this through as well, but a lot of it also done as a reaction to the ways that, particularly in, you know, forced migration and kind of humanitarian settings, images, particularly images of Black and brown and racialized bodies, are used in really specific ways to further specific agendas and the kind of dehumanize people in really troubling ways that play up these kind of tropes of, you know, lack of agency, what counts as a proper refugee. And you see this everywhere. You know, the UN is guilty of it, states are guilty of it, academics are guilty of it as well. There's all sorts of visual choices that are made that are incredibly extractive and really, really lack kind of a critical engagement. And really, this goes back to the kind of central kernel of the way I try and work. And that's always to try and figure out, how does the person that is sharing their space with me, how do they feel about being represented in this? You know, and if they're, for example, not a partner in our work and, you know, not the one kind of driving this, and they are really kindly sharing their story with me, you know, it's not up to me to then use their photo in a way to further my own career, to further the kind of messaging that we're putting out there, even if, you know, it's done for the kind of greater good, so to speak, you know, to highlight the harms. It's not up to me to decide that someone's face or someone's experience like that is there. I have certain people that I work with now for a while who gave me permission to use quotes, for example, or to, you know, show certain images that they feel comfortable with, but I would never take a picture of somebody and then use it on my Twitter feed or use it in the report at all. You will notice, for example, that there are no faces at all in the project, because at that point we also didn't want to put anyone in danger, because of course people are still very much impacted and experiencing what we are writing about and trying to get out there.
Totally. Well, thanks so much for the great explanation of the choices that you made there in terms of representation, because I think those are questions that are not just relevant for your report or reports on migration and tech, right, but much more broadly speaking for the human rights field, for journalism. So I think that's very relevant for our audience. I just wanted to get to basically the title of your report and the central theme of your report, technological testing grounds. There's a deliberate use, I imagine, of the word testing in the title. And just to say that we've had other conversations in this series where that element of testing also came up very clearly. We talked about the Australian cashless debit card, for instance, where that had been piloted, tested, if you will, on, for instance, Indigenous communities in Australia. There are many more examples that I could give from our work on digital government and human rights, where you see that new tech is often tested on communities that are less powerful first. And also thinking about the work of Virginia Eubanks, for instance, who makes that point repeatedly in her book, Automating Inequality, about using tech in social services in the US. Now, in migration in the EU and the use of tech, how do you see the role of experimentation? I mean, it strikes me that you often come across terms like pilots, test beds, sandboxes, and other sort of horrible jargon. So do you think that that is accidental, or do you think that those terminologies and what's behind that that shows up deliberately in these policy documents? And what's the purpose behind this testing rhetoric and testing environments?
Yeah, at least in our experience, it's definitely quite deliberate. And again, I think this goes back to the context that we were talking about throughout this talk, really. The fact that we're talking about immigration and refugee decision-making, a space that's historically extremely opaque, really difficult to parse out, and it's just really ripe for this type of experimentation. And again, this is just one manifestation. Kind of immigration and migration policymaking has often been thought of as kind of an experiment, policy-wise, law-wise, and now through technology. And I think the reason why this is allowed to happen, again, is it goes to show that there is a lack of kind of a governance mechanism when we're talking about different states, for example, putting forward pilot projects that are funded through different entities and sometimes partnering with academic institutions like the Horizon 2020 program in the EU. We're also talking about kind of extraterritoriality here, where you might have international organizations that are involved that are, of course, regulated in a very different way, if at all. They don't have to comply with certain regional directives or governance mechanisms. And then often you have the private sector heavily involved in all of this, both in terms of setting the agenda, but then also obfuscating responsibility, especially when things go wrong. Because when you're trying to compare the way that responsibility accrues between a public entity and a private entity, it's very different. And this is where kind of the individual or the community that's impacted can kind of fall through the cracks in the middle, because the public entity can say, well, it's really the responsibility of the private sector that's developing these technologies. And the private sector will say, well, it's really not our problem either, because we're just, we were just contracted to do this by the state. And then the individual rights holder, or if you're trying to push the law forward and argue for, community-based rights, the community has virtually very little stake in the game when it comes to kind of, again, trying to pin themselves to the scaffolding of our understanding of human rights. I think it's an interesting, I think, space to try and parse out, and this experimentation really comes into play in really disturbing ways. The AI lie detector, for example, that I mentioned at the beginning from iBorder Control, and there's another one called Avatar. I find the names also really fascinating, but perhaps that's a different talk. They're projects that are pilots, that are tested, that are kind of played around with, and sometimes they're not actually rolled out on populations kind of in real time. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is who gets to experiment on whom, and who gets to say, no, we are not okay with this. Like you said, Christian, it's always along the lines of power and privilege, whether we're looking at the welfare state or the criminal justice sector and the way that technology is playing out there, or in my case, borders and immigration. There is a huge power differential between those who develop and deploy the technology and the communities that are at the sharp edges of this technology.
Thank you very much, Petra. So talking about experiments and this notion that so much of these digital technologies are being deployed, say, far away from the border, or in places that one might call low rights spaces. How can there be meaningful accountability on the part of EU and its member states for human rights violation, where migration control increasingly happens before the border, but with the aid of digital technologies? How can accountability efforts be approached in these spaces?
Yeah, this is a question that keeps me up at night all the time, and I don't have the answers. I think it has to be kind of a multilateral way that we think about creating accountability and governance and regulation. It has to be localized, but it also has to be regionalized and internationalized, because we're really, right now we're talking about largely the EU, but this is a global phenomenon. But it becomes problematic and tricky when then you try and regulate and create some sort of system of accountability. I mean, I think this is where the human rights framework can be quite useful, particularly when we're looking at traditional ways that we can get policymakers or the courts to try and wrap their minds around how this is playing out on real people. But I think there's also a lot further that we can go, and we can learn from different traditions of trying to understand how rights and responsibilities accrue on communities, for example. Is there a collective right to privacy that a community can have? If not, why not? Why is the law so rigid when it comes to kind of being focused around an individual rights holder? And I think also there's a lot of more work that needs to be done on more kind of critical perspectives around surveillance technology and also the administration of the kind of public state. I think for me, at least, what's really instructive are the more abolitionist type perspectives and work of, for example, Harsha Walia on kind of the violent border logics that are inherent in bordering or creating borders and the way that the nation state is able to practice its kind of sovereign prerogative to control its borders. I mean, that's all tied to the way that the technology is playing out on people's lives. And the fact, as in my work, I argue, the lack of governance and regulation is actually deliberate. It's good for the state and it's good for the private sector actors who make a lot of money from it to not regulate the space, because then they're able to push pilot projects forward, kind of increase innovation without having to be accountable to anybody.
Thanks, Petra. I realized we're already in the last 15 minutes of our conversation. Time has really flown by. So I wanted to get to the Q&A, because there have been some amazing questions in the Q&A and in the chat. I'll try to group some together, because otherwise there would be too many for you to answer. So first, there are a couple of questions about how to get involved, basically. There's Kyla Yoon, who asks, how can law students and future lawyers stay informed and get involved in resisting widespread use of such technologies? Are there roles that lawyers can play, in particular as lawyers, or at least as global citizens? There's an anonymous attendee who basically asks a similar question. Do you have recommendations for how law students can get involved in similar work? What sort of experience training is valuable for us to pursue to work at the intersection of tech and immigration? And then there's perhaps a slightly different question, but on the same theme, by Bo-Eun Kwon. I'm wondering if the civil society NGOs within the EU are considering any strategies together to deal with the digital border issue. Are there any kind of united groups or meetings surrounding digital borders? So these are all questions about how to become active, which are great questions.
Great, and I'm writing them all down, so hopefully I don't miss anything. Thank you all for engaging with my ideas, and I'll try and get to all your questions if we can. Yeah, I mean, in terms of getting involved, particularly for law students, I think it's great to take as many courses that are kind of at the intersection of tech and law as possible, but also then to delve into these more critical perspectives of, abolitionism or whatever you want to call it. Take some sociology classes, take an anthropology class if you can. I went to law school a little later and I had my qualitative research training already in hand. And as I said, I'm a very reluctant lawyer anyways, but I was able to really, I think the fact it's important to pull from different perspectives and different kind of ways of looking at these issues, because as I hope to kind of share with you today, it's a really complicated area and we need all different disciplines, also people who understand the tech from the more technological side to then engage with the human rights side as well. But I think a lot of it has to do with kind of community building and learning from one another, whether it comes from lawyers learning from civil society sharing what they're seeing on the ground, academics sitting there and witnessing and not bulldozing too much space, which we sometimes see in this space quite often. And there's some really, really, I think, promising initiatives that are kind of out there that are really springing up now. I would encourage you to get in touch with us at the Migration and Technology Monitor. Our colleagues at Amnesty International are also putting together a really great network of people working on this. There's a few people at EDRI, the European Digital Rights, for example, that have been working on these issues. I did a research fellowship with them a few years ago, and we've been spinning out a few things there. So I think it's starting. I think we are managing to find each other now in ways that we were not able to before. I think one thing too, though, it's a resource issue, particularly in the migration justice space. Because again, often you're talking to civil society or lawyers or, social workers who are so overworked and underpaid that digital rights are kind of pushed to the side. But now I think more and more people are realizing that this really is the next frontier of these issues when it comes to kind of migrant justice organizing. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us who have more resources to enable this work to come up organically and from the grassroots from within the migrant justice organizations themselves.
Thanks so much, Petra. I'm going to group together two questions now, which are a bit different, but I'm going to do that for efficiency reasons. I could use some AI here. So first of all, Gavin Sullivan asks a great question. Could you say more on how we connect the human-centered approach that you mentioned and that human rights aspires to with algorithmic technologies that affect violence on human bodies, but by making humans governable through opaque risk profiles, inferences, and indicators, etc., that are opaque and hard for researchers, lawyers, and activists to access, i.e. how to connect the internal and external dimensions of algorithmic violence, and how does the securitization of digital bordering and increasing privatization of the borders make critiquing these developments and experiments more complex and difficult? So that's already a big question to mull on, but I just wanted to add a question of a different kind. I have to go to the chat for that, by Andrea Quijada, who asks, I'm curious if you happen to see similarities between what is happening in the EU and what has been happening in the US. I don't know if you look at all at the US, but so much of what you are saying resonates deeply with how the US border has ideologically and digitally shifted into Mexico to prevent migrants from moving from Central America into Mexico. So perhaps you can reply to those two questions, and then hopefully we'll have room for one more question at the end.
Great. And thank you so much, Christian, for knitting this together for me like this. This is really helpful. So yeah, Gavin's question is great because I think it gets at two issues that are inherent in trying to illuminate what is happening in border regimes generally, and then made further complicated by the fact that a lot of the technology is either proprietary or difficult to understand for someone who is not a coder or a computer scientist, or someone who can pick apart an algorithm and create a matrix of how the decision is made. Because also, of course, algorithmic decision making in and of itself is very opaque and hard to understand. And it's been critiqued, rightly so. I mean, I think part of that is interdisciplinary collaboration, working with technologists who are able to illuminate why something works the way it does. And then working, with civil society, with human rights lawyers, with journalists, to find ways to then critique and talk about these issues from an accessible perspective that gets at all these nuances. But I think your question also speaks to a really worrying development all over the world, and that is this kind of securitization or militarization of a lot of immigration regimes. And frankly, being on the ground is getting increasingly difficult. It's harder to access certain spaces. It's difficult to take pictures. It's difficult to contact people inside refugee camps. And that's a deliberate way that certain states and certain regions are securitizing the border, and then also critiquing it very, very difficult. So I think we're unfortunately going to see much sharper manifestations of this in the future. And this perhaps gets me to the second question about the similarities between the US and the EU contexts. Because of course, I think, again, this is a global phenomenon. I kind of accidentally found myself at the fringes of Europe, partly because of COVID and certain methodological constraints in terms of being able to do on-the-ground work during the pandemic. But our project is global. We really are trying to slowly knit this all together. And there are some really great folks doing work on the kind of smart bordering of the US-Mexico border, which again, of course, is deeply historical. And it predates, the Biden administration and even the Trump administration. It goes back all the way to Obama and even before, of course, with 9/11 giving the US kind of migration machine all sorts of leeway to securitize and quote unquote smarten its border with Mexico. And unfortunately, we are seeing the kind of parallels between, again, the sharpest manifestations of this. The rise of deaths in the desert are largely due to people having to take more dangerous routes as they're trying to avoid smart towers, different types of technologies that are present in the kind of border that is currently in play is really similar to what's happening in the Mediterranean and Aegean seas here. They really are violent borders that are bolstered by technology.
Thanks so much, Petra. We have time, I think, for an answer to two more questions, although we have only a few more minutes left. They're very different. First of all, Eric Raimondi has a question about methodology. He asks, when visiting Lesbos and Samos, what was your experience with camp authorities and security like? Were you able to physically access the camps yourself? And if so, how? Which is a very interesting question. And then there was a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, what AI use cases in migration and border control would you call for banning in the EU AI Act rather than categorizing them as high risk?
Oof, two excellent questions. I'll try and be brief because I know we have a few minutes. So the first one is interesting. And I mean, I should perhaps be somewhat diplomatic, but I'm not known for being that diplomatic. So I'll just tell you, I am able to get inside the camps largely because I ask sometimes for official permission to go on press tours, and I have been able to go so far. The more and more I write about this, the less and less access I will have, which unfortunately is, again, goes to what we were just talking about with the kind of securitization of the border. So for those of you who are doing qualitative work and also work that is considered perhaps a little bit more on the activist side of things, it's a balancing act always, because, you know, I think it's my responsibility to write about it. If I'm one of, 20 people who can go inside the Samos camp, then I think, like, why sit on that information and, put it in my book, which I'm now writing, and then like build my career on it and pat myself on the back 3 years later. That's not really that important. I think it's important to get that information out now. But sometimes when you ruffle certain feathers, then your access is curtailed. So it's always a bit of a balancing act. I am really lucky because here I work with quite a few journalists, and we often collaborate together. So it's easy to support each other when it comes to kind of access and also certain safety considerations that we all have to think about with this kind of work. And then in terms of the second question, when it comes to the regulation, oh gosh, yeah, this is a fascinating question. And I think the way this is going to play out in the coming months is going to be really, really telling in terms of how the EU will move forward. I mean, given that this is the end of our talk, perhaps it's no surprise that my somewhat abolitionist type leanings are coming out. So I would be more on the side of, banning high-risk technologies unless and until we can find a way, A, to get rid of systemic racism and violent border regimes, but that's probably not going to happen. So what would that actually look like to be using these technologies in ways that is at the very least rights respecting? I don't know if it's possible. However, so this is my like pie in the sky abolitionist, commitment that I have in my life and in my work. But I am also a realist. Perhaps this is where my reluctant lawyering comes in, because of course, realistically, calling for a full out ban may not get us anywhere when it comes to the recurrent kind of regulatory space that we find ourselves in the EU. So then we have to be strategic and figure out, okay, so are we okay, for example, and I'm not saying this is on the table because there's a coalition of us trying to actually figure out what some of these bans and recommendations would be. So if you are interested in this, I would say stay tuned because we will be coming out with something in the next 2 months or so. But it's a tough question because it's like, well, are we okay with, banning AI in refugee applications, but somehow fine with it in immigration? I mean, it sounds good in theory, but if I put my refugee lawyer hat on, people slip between categories and statuses all the time. And just because you're a refugee at one point in your life doesn't mean that you might not have a spousal visa in the future. Or maybe you'll adopt a baby from another country. Or maybe you'll just need to go for a conference somewhere else. And the fact that we then artificially would create this kind of distinction doesn't really sit well with me. Okay, so maybe that's not good. So then do we look at use cases? Do we look at regulating the private sector? It's a really complicated space and I don't really have the answers for it. And I think it's very much in development, and the next few months and years are going to be quite telling whether or not we can actually arrive at a ban. And the last thing I'll say, and I know we're running out of time, for me, what's really instructive is also the conversations around, for example, the really, really, really super high risk ways of using technology, for example, in warfare or autonomous weapons. I mean, we couldn't even agree on a ban to that. So how will we agree on a ban in immigration and refugee applications? I don't know. But I think we have to try for it and see how far we can push the conversation, because again, it has real harmful impacts on people.
Thank you so much, Petra, for your time and for your very inspiring talk today, and for not being diplomatic at times, which I very much respect and admire. Also to say that you just mentioned the importance of sharing your work and not just thinking about yourself. And I think that's imperative. And I think it's great that you're bringing that out. I'm often telling my 3-year-old to share, but I think it applies to all of us. And in part, it's in the spirit of this conversation series, which is all about sharing more widely the great work that people like you are doing. I also wanted to thank Ngozi today for being a co-host in this conversation. And also she's hidden, we can't see her face, but Victoria Adelment is really the driving force behind this conversation series, including this one. I also wanted to thank her very much for making this conversation today happen. Just to reiterate to our audience that the conversation has been recorded and will soon be made available on our website and also on the center's YouTube channel. Victoria shared the links earlier. And you should feel free again to share it with others and to use it in your teaching or in whatever other way you think is useful. We will also publish a brief blog once the recording is available, in which we will also highlight some of the materials that Petra has referred to, her own report, her earlier report in Canada, but also some other materials which are highly relevant, so you can use them again for your own purposes. And finally, to say, please join us for our next conversation in this series on the 24th of November, when we will interview Juan Lopez. He's a researcher at the Global Data Justice Initiative and at Colombian NGO Fundación Carisma. And we will talk about the use of digital technologies by the Colombian government for the transfer of pandemic relief payments. And that also proves to be a very interesting conversation. Thank you all for tuning in and hope to see you next month.